gonna make it shine. Equity law so fine, we're gonna make it shine. Title IX, Title IX, Title IX.
I am following directions from Loretto Gubernatis, whose name I want on this tape, from MDA Associates, who is incredibly generous in documenting the history of the Maryland Women's Heritage Center and all of our programs and initiatives. And we just want to express tremendous appreciation to her. Thank you, Loretto. And I should say the name of her company, McDonough Davis, is after her mother and her grandmother. It tells a lot about who are the important people in her life. I'm going to speak briefly about being an activist. When we were working for the passage of Title IX, I was a regular old grassroots mom, active. I'd originally been involved in the civil rights movement and involved in disability rights also, once I saw how people with disabilities were treated, and suddenly became aware, hey, I'm a woman, and everything isn't equal, and it isn't right. And so that became a third area of civil rights to become actively engaged in. I wanted to just briefly set the time. Bunny Sandler did some of that, but she mentioned about there was no internet. There was really not a lot of organized women's organizations in the same way. There were fraternities, sororities. There were certain organizations that have long histories. But the activist groups, we had just been forming the National Women's Political Caucus. We had meetings at places like Liz Carpenter's house. Remember, she was the PR person for Lyndon Johnson. We had, these kind of gatherings where, as Bunny said, it was a relatively small group of people. People like Sue Klein, who have been involved forever. People who, you knew everybody, and the wonderful part today is we don't know everybody, because so many people, both women and men, girls and boys, are engaged in working for fairness based on gender. I need to say I was in a consciousness raising group with NOW, and this will probably astound everybody, but in our consciousness raising group, we had assigned, not with our knowledge, an operative from one of our federal surveillance agencies. They did not know what the women's movement was about. They were threatened and concerned about what we might be planning. I mean, those terrible stories of bra burnings, I don't know how threatening that was. We don't think it ever happened. But it was actually of concern that we had an operative, a woman operative, from a federal agency infiltrating our consciousness raising group. And after a few of our gatherings, we figured out that she had to be something like that, because she was certainly coming from a different place from the rest of us. And we talked about it and decided that we believed so strongly in what we were working on that anybody who stayed with us long enough would have to come on board. And in fact, after some months, that actually did happen, and she actually blew her cover with us, which is how we knew that what we suspected was actually true. So you have to understand the time at that time, which was very different. Working for Title IX was not something natural. I mean, what Bunny created and what was worked on and what was drafted and was proposed was not universally supported. especially and including by many women who didn't see the need for it, who said, even Gladys Noon Spellman, and I talk about her a lot when I do work with student groups, for whom the Baltimore-Washington Parkway is dedicated. Most people know her name from riding on the Parkway, since she is now deceased for many years. But she, when we first talked to her about sponsoring Title IX, and we were her constituents, she said, well, I don't see why we need it. Women can pretty much do everything. You know, now we have the opportunity. I'm in Congress. She was a PTA mom and then on the Prince George's County Council. Well, we kept meeting with her, and eventually she had one of those aha moments when she remembered that when she was in junior high, she had been suspended from school for having the audacity to run on the boys' track. Suspended from school. And she couldn't come back to school unless a parent came back with her. This was our congresswoman. When she remembered that, she said, oh, and I remember how that felt. And she went back the next day to school when she was in junior high. It wasn't called middle school then. She went back, and you had to bring a parent back to potentially be readmitted to school. Her dad and she met with the assistant principal, who said that for her to be readmitted, she'd have to apologize for running on the boys' track. And her father, to his everlasting credit, said to the assistant principal, well, where is the girls' track? And the assistant principal said, there isn't one. And Gladys Spellman's father then said, well, sir, then I have to agree with my daughter. And that's one anecdote that I want to say, but those were the kinds of memories we were surfacing among members of Congress. So many of the supporters were dads of girls who wanted their daughters to have the full spectrum of opportunities that their sons had. They didn't want their daughters to have lesser in life. The other story I want to tell is when they voted on Title IX. I was there with my son, I remember vividly his shoes clattering around. You know, they have those marble floors in halls in Congress. He made so much noise up in the gallery, out in the hall while we're waiting for the vote. And I just remember this, we went down by the door where they were going in to vote. And a Southern congressman was standing by one side of the door, and they said outrageous things. If you passed Title IX, you know, it had all to do with bathrooms and showers and facilities. You know, that they were saying things that had nothing to do with Title IX. And this one gentleman, member of the House of Representatives, stationed himself at the side of the door and said to everyone in a very thick Southern accent, which I can't mimic, but he said, if you all vote for this law, your daughters are going to have to shower with the boys. And so Gladys Noon Spellman, instead of making it serious and challenging it, because that gave it more credibility than it deserved, stationed herself on the other side of the same door. And she just said, every time he said this, what he thought was a really scary caution, she stood on the other side of the door and she said, yep, and it's retroactive, you'll get to shower with the girls. And that's exactly what happened. The members of Congress coming in laughed, and it passed by a good margin. So we have a lot of pride from the state of Maryland in terms of the initiation, in terms of the passage. And then the last thing I want to raise for my part of the panel is, because mine is the grassroots part, there was a 3-year gap between the passage of Title IX in 1972 and the date for implementation, which was 1975. Linda Shevitz asked me, I found among my papers recently this HEW notice from 1974 by Caspar Weinberger, Secretary of HEW. Look at how proud it is. You can see I don't keep my files in an archival manner. But this is a historic piece of what the guidance was from HEW about Title IX back then. So in those 3 years, each school system, institution of higher ed was supposed to do what was called an institutional self-evaluation. And Bunny and others, a lot focused on higher ed, we were focusing on K through 12. And there was created a formula for helping citizens and women's groups get the data they needed to assess the status of Title IX and gender equity in their local school systems. It was called Cracking the Glass Slipper. And it was piloted. We had to test it out to see would it work. Could people use that throughout the country to monitor their own school systems? So that program was piloted in Prince George's County, Maryland.
It was.
Yes, it was. And we had a group of us from many different women's organizations, AUW, BPW, now Delta Sigma Theta, Alpha Kappa Alpha. We had a whole bunch of different groups, had representatives to get trained in how to get this information from very reluctant school systems that didn't at that point disaggregate their data by gender. They weren't reporting data by gender to any agency. And we were wanting to know too, how do you cross-tabulate this data so that you look at gender and race together? Like, was it different for white girls than it was for African American girls? Or vice same with boys. They certainly never thought to combine these issues because all of us have both gender and race. But they didn't seem to look at people as whole people that might have a gender and a race and a disability and all of that. And we were asking for things they never before had to produce. We piloted it. The only thing I want to share about that is the training we held in a recreation center that I think Patricia Fenn helped arrange for us to use because she was then working for Maryland National Capital Park and Planning. So we got to use this rec center without charge because of course we had no funds. And it was in the middle of winter. There was no heat. The heat was broken there. So the women who came and went through this day of training to go out and take the field and work for Title IX sat there, interacted, learned the techniques, made suggestions for modifications in their jackets, in their scarves, in their gloves, and they worked until they got it refined and then went out to do the work. And that instrument was then used throughout the United States to ascertain what was, in fact, the status of Title IX and gender equity in school systems throughout this country. So those are just some anecdotes you might not read in the books, but these are stories that I thought were worth sharing and preserving because that's what it was really like for the devoted girls and women and some of our men, and I have 2 sons, so they know all of this inside and out because they really believe in it. It wasn't only women, but it was led by and coordinated and primarily with women and women's groups. And I can never express enough appreciation to the collaboration, no competition. It was really working together across groups and communities and to try and see that this finally happened.
Thank you. Truly inspiring. And you were at the grassroots and I was kind of up at the treetops then. One of the things I want to do before I do anything else is just thank the Women's Heritage Center for shining a light on Title IX. This is such an important law that people now take for granted. You know, and one of the things I really personally tickled at is I'm part of the historical perspective section. I used to be the youngest kid in the room when we were working on Title IX. I was just a couple of years, and I actually think some people call me the kid behind my back. Yeah. And I was just a couple of years out of college, and you know, now I'm living history. Is that cool or what? Yeah. And I mean, I even brought someone with me who's doing a history project, and I'm a primary source. I mean, you know, does it get better than that? Does it really get better than that? You know, I started working on Title IX just a few days after it became law. It became law on June the 23rd, 1972. And I moved from Boston down to work with Buddy Sandler on what was then a new project, but it was already influential, the Project on the Status and Education of Women. And Buddy, I just want to thank you for so many things, for what you taught me, for your friendship, for your mentorship, most of all for tolerating my bad puns. And, you know, everything I've learned for you, and I continue to learn, is just something for which I'm forever be grateful. Thank you. Like Buddy said, we knew from the outset that Title IX was important, but we really didn't quite realize that it was going to be the most important legal provision for women since the passage of women's rights to vote, women's suffrage, in 1920. And as Buddy said, it quickly became clear that sports was going to become the engine of Title IX, but we didn't know what that meant. I mean, my sports career peaked when I was 8 and played badminton in the front yard in the inner city of Prince Frederick in Calvert County. And if you've ever been there, you probably missed the town. But that was the peak of my career. And one day, Buddy turned to me and said, "Margaret, you know, sports is going to be really important. We should just figure it out." And so I said, sure, I can do that. So what I did was I started to dig in, I did research, I made phone calls, I had a student intern that was gathering these little tiny little stories, because they're all little tiny stories about women in sports. A couple of the first reports on women's college sports were starting to come out, and they were you know, documenting all these things. A few things came over the transom. We would get a letter from a coach or an athlete documenting some really disturbing discrimination or problem. And like Buddy said, it was a different time. I mean, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have the Google, we didn't have the tweet, we didn't have the Facebook, we didn't even have computers. And today, especially, I think these earrings are made out of typewriter keys. So I brought because that's what we had. We had typewriters, and we had whiteout, and we had, look at the artifacts, correcting tape that we would use when we wanted to make a correction, and you would put it on the line.
Ditto machines.
And we had ditto machines, and we had carbon paper. And it was just a totally different day. Now, what resulted from all of this, does anyone want this to take home? It's so old, there's no sticky stuff on it anymore. Here, I may give it to you as an artifact. Okay, so it was a totally different time, and you have to realize that we didn't know what we were doing, and we ended up doing it quite well. Now, the report that came out was this little document, which was pasted up on larger paper, photo-reduced, typed, used lots of this stuff. And this is actually my original copy back then, where I hand wrote in the names of the institutions that we did not name. I mean, I think this is the only place where this exists. And you know, we were starting, as this was coming out, to see Title IX on the front page, to see the football coaches and other people get revved up about it. James Mitchell, you all heard James Mitchell, best-selling artist. Well, he quoted me in the book nobody ever read that he wrote called Sports in America. And he called this little report a model of restraint, persuasion, and good sense, but it also has a sharp bite because it identified all the areas in which there might be discrimination. And this report actually provided the structure for the Title IX regulation in sports. Now, what popped out of this? There was a really stark picture that we began to document as best we could. No athletic scholarships for women, fewer women teams in sports, fewer female teams getting the male cast-offs, female coaches working for free while the guys got release time or pay, bake sales for the women and rights, and they were the ones that developed the glass slipper. Judy Lichtman, who just started the Women's Legal Defense Fund, which is now the National Partnership for Women and Families. Marcia Greenberger and her colleagues at the National Women's Law Center. Donna Shavlik and Emily Taylor at the American Council on Education, Office of Women in Higher Education. Shirley McCune and Marty Matthews at the National Education Association, National Foundation for the Improvement of Education. Margot Pallavi, who was the lawyer for the Association for Intercollegiate Athletics for Women, which had governed women's athletics and was eventually killed by the NCAA. Ellen McGovern, lobbyist with the American Association of University Women. On Capitol Hill, women like Barbara Dixon, who was a top aide to Senator Birch Bayh. Shirley Downs, who worked with Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. Inside HEW, people like Peter Holmes, Martin Gary, attorneys like Gwen Gregory, Jeff Arlenes, Alexandra Butte, who actually wrote the documents themselves. And, you know, as Title IX became more understood, there were people on campuses and communities across the country who were doing exactly the same kind of thing. A small number of people making a huge difference. You know, just last month, I was speaking to the Calvert Association of Student Councils about Title IX. And one of the things I was struck was how bright and smart and engaged these kids were. And the other thing that struck me is how clueless they were about what life was like before Title IX. I mean, they just could not understand, and Emma was there. They took all the rights for granted. They didn't realize how opportunities just a relatively few years before had been so very different. That women would get admitted to graduate or law school seemed normal to them. That girls could excel in sports and still be the most popular girl seemed normal. It was hard for them to imagine that a really gifted girl would be encouraged to become a legal secretary and her brother would be encouraged to become a lawyer. And they were dumbfounded at the idea of help wanted male and help wanted female columns in the papers, or the fact that women couldn't get credit. I know when I first got out of college, I went to Saks Fifth Avenue. I had a job, I had a salary, and tried to get a credit card, and they told me my father would have to sign for me. Now, not that I would hold a grudge, but I've rarely been back there since then. You know, there's been a huge amount of progress, but there's still a long way to go. There's still fewer women in high school sports than there were 40 years ago. And even today, lots of colleges and schools would flunk the Title IX test. You know, things aren't perfect, but they are a heck of a lot better. You know, Title IX's effect on athletics is important because it's a metaphor for women being strong and able and winning in society. That's the message there. Title IX will continue to grow. It will continue to change. And so I'd like to close with this word. Now, I don't have a baton to pass, but I do have a button to pass. And these were the buttons that Bunny and I bought back in 1973-74 when we were lobbying on Capitol Hill to prevent Title IX from getting amended. And it says, "God bless you, Title IX." And so, Emma, I'm passing the The button. Right. Not the baton, but the button. So I just want to end with the congratulations to the Maryland Women's Heritage Center, and that all of you may have the joy of passing your own button, the baton, or whatever. Thank you.
Well, I guess it's my turn. I'd like to talk a little bit about Title IX in terms of school system perspective, because that's where I became involved with Title IX. And I have to say to you that before 1995, I don't think I really gave the idea of Title IX a lot of thought, you know, just didn't think about it. Although I know all through my years of growing up, I was affected by discrimination, but I didn't call it that. You know, when I was in college and I wanted to play basketball, and I loved basketball, even as short as I am. I mean, I was even a guard, you know, I had to play basketball. But I was always stymied by the fact that I could only do half court. That would get on my nerves, so and every now and then I'd make a mistake and go across, and oh, that was terrible, you know, you couldn't go across. Or the fact that that unwritten message that I know we got in high school, being a girl, you just did not do well in math and science. And yet I did so well in calculus. You know, something was wrong with me. You know, I really liked it. But I didn't pursue it. I mean, it was not one of the things that I even thought about pursuing. Or the fact that when I got married and was a teacher, and I said the story before, you know, and I had 4 children, so you know how many times I had to leave school. So you had to leave school before you showed, which is about 4 months. And you couldn't come back until about 6 months afterwards. I mean, that was strictly a law, you know. Or when I first began to interview for being a principal, what I would always get was, at that time I was a little tinier than I am now, you know, put on weight and all that. But they would look at me and say, are you sure you could handle being a principal? You know, could you do that? I mean, it was a struggle for me to actually get that position, you know, as a woman, and I think as an African American also, and also based on my size. Those were all those kinds of things that sort of, I didn't think about it in terms of Title IX. Or the fact that when I was going for my doctorate, I shall never forget this, I was in a program first before, I don't know why I'm doing this, before I was in an AGS program, Advanced Graduate Specialist Program, and there were men and women. The professor actually told the men that he would help them get into the doctoral programs, but we women didn't really need that. So that when I went to the doctorate, so when I went for my doctorate, it was not because the professor was encouraging the women in the program. All the men were sort of guided to go into the program. But we women, we had husbands, we didn't need to have a doctorate, we were not the sole breadwinners of a, so those are just some kinds of things. Now what happened in 1995, I was appointed by my superintendent as the director of equity, the equity office in Prince George's County. And so I was in that position from 1995 to 2005. And during that time, that was when I had 18 years ago, the very first awareness of what Title IX really was. And some of the people that I really touched base with was the Mid-Atlantic Equity Center, was consortium then, the Maryland State Department of Education, which was Jill and Susan and Linda. Those kinds of people who really gave me the sort of background that I needed to do the work. And so what I'd like to do then is just kind of talk about how I saw my role and just give you a little bit of snippets of stories from that position as the Equity Assurance Officer. And at that time, Title IX was one of my key responsibilities. So Prince George's County, and I need to brag a little bit because this is really a true happening, was one of the first counties to actually have a specific non-discrimination policy that covered the whole school system. Also had provisions where you could do a grievance procedure. And our policy was so well put together
that many systems in the school system in Maryland actually modeled after us on that policy. And one of the things that we did, every year, every person in the county, from the top to the bottom, secretaries, custodial staff, everybody, transportation, up to the administration, had to go through that training. It was mandatory. And they also had to sign off that they had the training. And that was one of the things that we did in the county that I thought was really, looking at that whole thing of discrimination. And when we talked about it, it was with the students as well as staff. So it wasn't just student to student, but it was student, staff, all the way through the whole school system. So that was one of the things that I thought was, very forward thinking for the system. Now, we did not have a Title IX coordinator per se until a very smart, astute young woman came aboard, and she was our Title IX coordinator, and that was Ms. Pamela Harris, who then had that position and oversee that whole kind of experience in our school system. And then I want to talk a little bit about pregnancy and parenting. The interesting thing about pregnancy and parenting, and as you all know, if you are pregnant, if you're pregnant or if you're a parent, you can go to any school that you choose to. At least you should have that right. In our county, we do have at least 2 locations where we do have pregnant students that they can choose to go to, but they don't have to, but many of them choose to do so. One of the interesting things about that is that when young women who are pregnant and they have to go out maybe because they're not feeling well or maybe at the beginning of the pregnancy, they are entitled to get education, to continue their education, just like if you broke your leg and you were home. That was a real battle with teachers to have them know that they were entitled. They tended to think, well, they didn't have to get pregnant, it's their fault, we don't have to. And that was one of the battles that we had to continually fight. Those youngsters were due an education, and we had to make sure that education continued. The single-sex education program, that was one of the biggest things that, for me, was, I don't know if I felt Title IX and that single-sex education program, and this is coming from Rita, we had a program, Black Male Achievement, in Prince George's County, that I thought was absolutely fantastic. And it was really doing some wonderful things for boys in the county who for many years in the county were given the short shift. They were suspended 3 times as much as any other kids. They were pushed out, and so this program came into effect. Well, there was a lawsuit filed with OCR. I think it's OCR, right? Okay. Yes. And as a result, that program had to be disbanded. And I always had mixed feelings about that. And I still have mixed feelings about that. Because I think that sometimes there are times when you need special programs for boys and for girls. And my thought was, and of course now we are way past that now, is that I think that if the school system had taken another role to actually talk about why this was important for this particular time, based on past history, maybe that program in some form would have been considered. One of the things that OCR does that I feel that they do is they don't have a lot of people who go out and investigate, so they will do what I call a desk audit, and they will kind of take word for what goes on without really actually going to make a visit. And I know that has to do with people and time and all that kind of thing. The other thing I wanted to mention was the whole thing about employment. As an equity officer, we were very much involved in the employment issue as well, and making sure that, that there was no discrimination in terms of hiring people for specific jobs. And of course, that was always challenging, because most people, when they come for a job, most people feel that they need that job and they're qualified for that job. But sometimes, you really have to kind of look at qualifications. That had to be the bottom line for when we were doing this kind of work. The last thing I guess I want to talk about is standardized testing. I have 1 minute here, okay. standardized testing, one of the things that our office did, we did review of tests. And I think that was a big deal, looking at tests, looking for gender bias, looking at textbooks, looking forward to make sure that females were equally represented in a way that was realistic, so that when children were reading, that they saw themselves in the textbooks. So I want to close by saying that I think athletics will always be one of the things that kind of drives Title IX. It's going to be up there always. I remember fighting for cheerleaders in the school system. The boys who played football got on the bus and went to play. The girls who were cheerleaders, who must be there, that was one of the stipulations, they had to find their own transportation to get there. And so that was one of the things that we changed. You know, they could get on the bus as well. I guess I want to say in closing that this has been a great journey for me. My 9-year-old grandchild who comes here with me as an adjunct, he sits here and he watches some of the Title IX tapes and he says, Grandma, you know, that doesn't make sense. Why wouldn't they want women to do this? Why wouldn't they want women to vote? And I think that's the boys that we're talking about, boys that don't understand why we have this kind of discrimination. Thank you.
It is a pleasure to be here. I told Linda I was going to come and see her project a couple of years ago, and I didn't come, and I'm thrilled. And I'm going to tell people about this. My involvement, I should tell you, who are Marylanders, that when I came to teach at the University of Maryland in 1964, I know, old. I had been at the Michigan State University teaching and coaching for 4 years, and I had been in a high school. And I'll tell you right now, the only time I got paid to coach was in that high school outside of Philadelphia. But when I came, they had interest groups. And I came to coach field hockey and basketball. And I did it for a year with interest groups. And then I said, this was all run from the Women's Physical Education Program, not the athletic department at that point. And I said to Cass, who ran the Women's Intramural Program, I said, look, I'm a coach, and I don't coach interest groups. I coach teams. Can't we change that name now? So in 1965-66, we had teams, and I talked my friend Margarita Riggy into, wouldn't you like to coach a lacrosse team? I think we need to. Anyway, we went from just about 4 teams, and then we added track, and we added gymnastics, and we added Marguerite's lacrosse. We did share the driving. And I'll never forget being on 16th Street when one of the students' cars broke down. And you probably know her name. She's very active in the gay and lesbian program. Pat Griffin. Well, you know, you get older, it escapes. Anyway, Pat's car broke down. So here, I piled the people she had in the car into mine to get down to GW and play in the tin capsule, I think they call it. It was a really strange gym. We played at the Printer Field House, which in our stands were those chairs where the arm came out, so they came out of the classroom. I envision all that, and then I suggest you go to one of the women's basketball games at the University of Maryland. They played last night, but they have a lot of good games coming up, and just see, A, their skill, B, the excitement, the support, it's just terrific. That you don't need to do any more to know about what Title IX has done for those young women. When I came here, Prince George's had no program. Anne Arundel had a gymnastics program. Montgomery County had like interest groups, and if someone knew honor teams, right? And if someone knew how to play hockey or basketball, I knew they came from Baltimore County. No offense to the others, they have made great changes. My first involvement with some of these folks downtown, because I was rather busy at the university, was when we got a call from our national office, Division of Girls and Women's Sports on 16th Street, and said, listen, we had this call, they wanted to, and when they were writing the guidelines, they wanted to have one team for each sport. You can't do that. So Joanne Holt and I dug into all of our research and wrote a paper on differential strength. And down we went and presented this. I hope it had, pardon, 2 minutes. Okay, so that had a different. In 1976, I left the university. Some people thought I was against Title IX. What I was against was not being listened to and not having a university that would take a chance and try to develop a women's model. I wrote articles, I had drawings and so forth. And I said, well, this is nuts. So I left, and 4 of us, Joanne and Margarita Riggi and Barbara Ryman from AU, formed a company, Athletic and Sport Consultants. Thanks to the desegregation assistance centers, in those days, I ate, and that's the only reason. And we also then started a nonprofit Educational Sport Institute. We had 2 grants from the Women's Educational Equity Act. Because one of the big problems was physical education had to go co-ed, and they didn't know how to teach. One last thing, I spent 2 years as the Gender Equity Monitor for Athletics for Montgomery County. And I was in every school, upper school, and they did a terrific job. One last thing that I can't leave you with, there are many small people who made this whole thing work. And this is the journal from Oberlin College. Oberlin not being Division I high-priced sports. But my great niece is a sophomore there, and so my nephew brought that to me. And then the inside page is this. And there's one lone woman down here in the corner, and an article about how this coach, she also had a friend, and they were running on the only track they had. And there was a triangular medium. One of the people came, and I won't divulge the school, and he said, well, I'm not, my men are not running if those girls run. And even though the Oberlin coach said, they won't be in the scoring, they're just going to run. The other team said, fine, they will run. And that's one way to cut short, but anyway. And so they ran anywhere. And he's one of the small people. It was way, way back that he did that. And those young women ran, and that young woman in the corner is now a lawyer. Thanks very much.
You can see why Maryland is having this celebration. Incredible contribution of Maryland women.
Only 64% of African American and Hispanic girls are playing sports, a little over half of Asian girls, and that's compared to about 3/4 of white girls. So we in particular are really looking at the barriers that women and girls of color continue to face in sports and what sports they are playing, and that's a focus of ours to really try to get those participation rates up. For immigrant families, 3/4 of the boys from immigrant families are playing sports, and about less than half of the girls are. At the college level, while we have more than half of the students in most of our colleges are women, we still see only about 44% of the participation opportunities going to women. And then when you look at expenses, the picture is even more bleak. At the typical Division I football bowl school, for instance, women receive about only 28% of all the money that's spent on athletics, and about 31% of recruiting dollars. So there's still a lot of work to do, and I can tell you that I've been involved in many cases I've been at the Senate now 15 years, believe it or not, because I love my job so much, so I just stay. I've been at 15 years. I came straight out of law school, did a fellowship, just landed at the center. I was very lucky. I am one of the first lawyers in my family, and I think I just sort of was in the right place at the right time. Somebody put me there. So thank you. So anyway, I talk to parents all the time from across the country, and some of the most common complaints we get are the girls' softball field is a mess. They are using porta potties. They have no backstops. They have no batting cages. They have no lights, and the boys have things that look like minor league baseball stadiums. This happens a lot. There are a lot of sports that girls still want to play that schools are not offering. And so we are regularly involved in complaints with OCR, lawsuits. We always try to resolve it short of that, and we do give parents and students a lot of good advice, and they're able to use that to make changes at their schools. But unfortunately, somebody earlier said that change doesn't really happen without a lawsuit, and often that is the case. One thing I did want to point out about Maryland, my home state too, is that in that fact sheet on athletics, what we did this year is we ranked states based on the percentage of high schools in the state that had participation gaps of 10 percentage points or more. So that, 10 percentage points we just picked as a benchmark, because if you have a 10 percentage point gap between the, girls enrolled and their participation rate, that's pretty big and usually means that you have a lot of room to grow. And earlier, they can be voluntary, but they have to be equal to what other students are getting in school. So for instance, several years ago, New York had to actually shut down all of its so-called P schools. There was a big article in the New York Times about it. And they were closed because they were basically sending pregnant girls to these schools, pushing them out of school, but they were in no way getting a comparable education. According to the New York Times article, they were sewing quilts instead of doing geometry. And, quote, in place of proms and computer labs, they had Mother's Day parties and daycare centers with cribs lining the walls. So again, not a bad idea to provide them with extra services. You might need daycare services, but you have to also have an academically rigorous, equally rigorous curriculum and extracurricular activities. So it has to be voluntary. And so what we've been doing, because we've been hearing so much about this and we've known about it for some time now, is that we also are looking at state laws and policies. And that's what our recent report did. It looked at education laws in all the 50 states, Puerto Rico and DC. And just a couple of quick findings from that report. We found that less than half of the states explicitly make homebound or hospitalized instruction services available to pregnant students. So, and I think you really do have to sort of explicitly talk about this in your policy. Only 6 states specifically address pregnant parenting students in their attendance policies at all. And most states, in fact, had no laws or policies designed to support this group of students, and in fact, many had laws and policies that were exacerbating the problems that these young women were facing. So, I think just to close, we obviously are working on these issues, as are many others here and around the country, and we work at all levels. There are bills in Congress that we need support for. We obviously work in the administration to try to urge OCR to do more, and we try to educate people, and Linda and others have been a great partner in giving us opportunities to speak to athletic administrators and others and Title IX coordinators. So that's it for me, and I thank you for having me.
So first off, thank you for those of you who have hung in here. You get extra bonus points today, and do play the lottery because you're going to win. So I've had an interesting journey. I won't go into it, but I've spent an enormous amount of time working around issues of STEM, particularly IT and engineering, and the question came to me about sort of what's the future. And I want to say that we're not doing well. It is an area that remains not only challenging, but there's a lot of unique problems that we sort of didn't pay attention to. Specifically, there was a report out just a few months ago, really well done, from the Institute of Women's Policy Research that shows that in the last decade, we've actually lost ground in every single area except biology, where we just remain the same. So we have fewer women going into STEM than we did even a decade ago. And if people will often say, oh, it's because they're going to four-year institutions. No, they're not. And if we look at the career pipeline, we're also seeing fewer women. And there's a reason for that, I think. This is my assumption, and it could be wrong. Frankly, many, many years ago, there were many areas where women were excluded. Because we have broken down so many barriers, so the ones that remain become even more challenging. Why would you want to stay in a career that is so difficult when there are so many different options where you can be comfortable? Let me give you an example. My own daughter works at an aerospace company. She went in, she's highly qualified, she's got a master's degree, she's a terrific engineer. She goes to fairs, they call her a booth babe. One of the gentlemen said to her, oh, good news, we finally have a cupcake at the bake table. This is treated exactly the way it was treated back in the 70s. She's in a team, a leadership team. She was selected for a leadership team. There are 40 people. She's the only woman. And I have to tell you that she did probably, they broke them into small groups. In her group, she probably did 70–80% of the work. So what's different? What's changed? It's shocking, right. But here's what's even worse about, unfortunately, the bad news. She doesn't have the language. She doesn't have the community. There's not a national uprising for women. She has an experience of being isolated. Nobody's talking to her about gender discrimination. And if she voices it, she gets lambasted by the other people in the group saying, come on, it's already been solved. It must just be you. People forget that it's hard work. We talk about what we accomplished, but what we didn't hear is how hard, how many lonely nights, how many people screamed at you, how bad you felt. I loved, Bonnie, that you were Bonnie, about when you were saying, I went home and cried. And we have. But we don't talk about that to the young women. And sometimes I have conversations with women today and I say, you know, yeah, you're the tall poppy. Somebody's trying to cut you down. That's typical. Expect that. And they're surprised. They don't understand that this work is hard, it's lonely, but that isn't you. That's just the work. And it's okay. And there are still a community of women who will support you. I think on a larger scale, a strategic level, I just want you to know over the past year, one of the things that I've been very concerned about is the elimination of the Gender in Science and Engineering program from the National Science Foundation. There's a real push to remove those programs, both that one and the Research on Disabilities and Education program. I was privileged to serve on the Committee of Visitors, which does a 3-year review of that program. And I asked as a request, as I was reviewing the program, because they're making a point, in fact, one of their strategic plans is to integrate the issue of disability across all of the different divisions, which sounds like a great idea, right? So I said, okay, let me look at the data to see how well that's doing, how well is that doing, how are we going to move forward? And the response was, that's none of your business, that's outside the scope of your work. We don't allow you to look at that. Well, there's an interesting issue, isn't it? We've heard that before. So these are the areas of research around STEM for people with disabilities and for women. And if we eliminate these programs, can we assume that those will be mainstream throughout? No. We cannot. And yet there is this perception, the final barrier, that everything is now okay. So actually, I think it's great that we're here celebrating. And today we should celebrate, and I thank particularly Linda for her work in this area because she's been a champion of mine for such a long time. But unfortunately, it's not time to be too comfortable. Right. we have to keep yelling. We have to keep educating our daughters and our sons. And we have to help give them the tools to keep the fight alive. Because we do have a few generations to go. Thank you.
What I'm going to talk about is an experience that I had yesterday. You've been given a lot of statistics, and I think that I'm going to build on what Buddy said at the end of your comments, which is that the struggle for women and girls remains a worldwide struggle. And I think that with the way in which particularly younger people look at the rest of the world, that there really are no borders. We really do live in a flat world, a world that is very different from the one in which I grew up and many of you grew up in, a world where we could be teachers, we could be secretaries, or we could be dental hygienists. That was sort of the options that we had when we were going to college. Yes, we certainly have a long way to go. There are certainly areas that we've already discussed where we need to make improvements, and we always need to remain vigilant. There are always people waiting there to take away rights, we know that. But it also gave me a perspective that in this country, things that were once marginalized have now become mainstream practices. And I think we need to really just reflect on that, make sure that it maintains in that way and that we expand it. But I think we also have to honor the progress that we've made. For example, in India, when girls were asked whether or not they liked being girls, 50% of them responded that they would prefer not to be girls. There are 10 million child brides worldwide. 10 million. Just think about that. I don't even like to use, again, the word brides, because to me that constitutes something that's more positive than what this is. This is really slavery. In Ethiopia, 25% of young women attend a post-secondary institution. In 10 years, the statistic has only gone up 4%. So I think that in terms of the way that we work, the challenges that we see both nationally and internationally, we are stronger because of the collaboration that we now are able to do across this universe. And what is so clear to me is that the issues are universal. What we have in common is so profound and so powerful that I think that what we need to do is to make sure that we maintain and improve what we have here, and that we look to shores beyond just the United States, because until everybody has equal opportunity, we are still in a situation where discrimination is lethal.
One thing, as far as MSD and Title IX, just to say we have a Title IX coordinator in every school system, we communicate regularly, we have training for them, but there's still a long way to go. Most of them send back surveys, less than 10% of their time is spent on Title IX, no budget whatsoever. A lot of them, nobody else in the school system works with them. Some of them have sessions of instruction, whatever. So we, follow up from MSD, but we need a lot of help in that arena. In the National Coalition for Women and Girls in Education, you got one of these in your packet. It tells a lot. I do want to say that 40 years, I've never seen Title IX get so much attention. There was a reception at the White House. There was a reception in Congress. I have over there a whole book of articles that appeared, and books like Susan Klein that did the Achieving Gender Equity Through Education handbook. In terms of Title IX statewide, all of you have just been incredible, and of course the Heritage Center is very proud to be a part of that.